What did you just say, Julian? At our mother's funeral, before I could even process the grief of her passing, my eldest brother, who only showed his face once a year during the holidays, was busy putting on a grand performance for the guests to hear what a devoted son he was. But the moment the room grew quiet, he turned to me and shouted about the inheritance mother left behind. "What exactly do you think you did to deserve a single cent?" he yelled. In that instant, a wave of sorrow and white-hot rage surged through me. What choice will Emily make in this moment? Welcome to our channel. Before we begin today's story, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest thoughts your way. Now let us begin today's story. The gray morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Boston like a heavy, damp shroud, chilling the bones of those who dared to walk through the historic district. Rain fell in a rhythmic, somber drizzle, blurring the outlines of the red brick townhouses and the sharp steeples of the Old North Church. It was the kind of weather that felt ancient, a cold breath of the Atlantic that mirrored the heavy atmosphere inside the sanctuary, where the final farewell to Martha Sterling was taking place. Emily Sterling sat in the front pew, her body feeling small and fragile under a black wool coat that seemed several sizes too large for her gaunt frame. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and raw from days of relentless weeping. At 45, Emily looked as though she had aged a decade in the last 8 years, a physical testament to the toll of being a primary caregiver. Her hands, calloused and trembling slightly, were clasped tightly in her lap. Standing a few feet away was Julian Sterling, the eldest brother. Julian was the picture of polished corporate success, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Emily's car. He was tall with a sharp jawline and a practiced, stoic expression. While Emily was a portrait of raw, unshielded grief, Julian moved with the calculated grace of a politician. He shook hands with the mourners, his voice a low, melodic baritone that conveyed a perfect level of sorrow, enough to elicit sympathy, but not so much that it ruined his professional veneer. As the choir's voices echoed against the high-vaulted ceiling, Emily's mind drifted away from the eulogies. The scent of the lilies in the church began to fade, replaced in her memory by the sharp, sterile smell of antiseptic and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender lotion she used to rub into her mother's paper-thin skin. She remembered the silence of 3 in the morning in their home in Providence. She remembered the dim light of the bedside lamp as she carefully unwrapped the bandages from her mother's legs, her own back throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, the first signs of the herniated disc that now made every movement a chore. Martha would often look at her with eyes clouded by pain and age, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Emily. You should be out living your life." Emily would simply smile, kiss her mother's forehead, and reply, "There is nowhere else I'd rather be, Mom." While Emily was lost in these ghosts of devotion, Julian felt his phone vibrate in his breast pocket. He checked the time, his brow furrowing, not with grief but with impatience. To him, this service was a ceremonial hurdle before the real work began. He stepped back from the line of mourners, slipping quietly into the shadows of the narthex. Ensuring he was out of earshot, Julian pressed the phone to his ear. "Did you get the appraisal for the Providence property?" he whispered harshly into the receiver. "I don't care about the historical preservation status right now. I need to know the market value of the land. It's a prime lot near the university. Call me back with a hard number by the time I'm out of the cemetery." He hung up, straightened his tie, and stepped back into the sanctuary, his face instantly shifting back into a mask of somber tragedy. The service drew to a close with a final, stirring prayer from Pastor Miller. As the congregation began to rise, the heavy oak doors opened to let in a gust of cold, wet air. The reality of the burial ahead settled over the room like a physical weight. Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Julian. For a moment, she hoped for a word of comfort, a brotherly embrace to acknowledge the 8 years of labor she had endured alone. Instead, Julian leaned down, his breath smelling faintly of expensive espresso. He didn't look at the casket. He looked at Emily with eyes that were cold and transactional. "Dry your tears, Emily," he whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth he had used with the guests. "We need to be practical now. We're heading to the house in Providence after the burial. We need to discuss the will and the property distribution before the tax office starts asking questions on Monday morning. I've already set a schedule." Emily looked up at him, her breath hitching in her throat. The man standing before her didn't see a grieving daughter or a sister who had sacrificed her youth. He saw a line item on a balance sheet. The coldness of the Boston rain outside was nothing compared to the chill that settled in her heart as she realized the battle for her mother's legacy was only just beginning. The drive from the rain-slicked streets of Boston to the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods of Providence felt like a descent into a past that was rapidly being dismantled. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Julian's pristine black SUV, the silence inside the vehicle heavy and suffocating. Outside, the windshield wipers swiped rhythmically, clearing the mist only to reveal the familiar sights of the city where she had spent nearly a decade in a self-imposed exile of devotion. When they pulled into the gravel driveway of the family home, a weathered two-story colonial wrapped in a deep porch, Emily felt a fresh wave of grief. The house looked tired. Without Martha's constant presence, the structure seemed to have lost its spine. Emily's eyes immediately drifted to the garden beds flanking the porch. Martha's prize-winning tea roses, once vibrant bursts of crimson and gold, were bowing their heads. The petals were brown and curled at the edges, thirsty and neglected during the frantic final weeks of hospital vigils. To Emily, those dying flowers felt like a mirror to her own soul, withered, exhausted, and forgotten in the shadows of more aggressive things. Waiting on the porch was Mark Sterling, the middle brother. Unlike Julian's sharp, corporate edge, Mark carried the weary, disheveled look of a man constantly fighting a losing battle. He was shorter than Julian, with a soft midsection and a face that seemed perpetually flushed from stress. He owned a mid-sized Italian bistro in downtown Providence that had been struggling since the pandemic. He stood there in a rumpled suit, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. "About time," Mark muttered as they climbed the stairs. He didn't offer Emily a hug. He barely met her eyes. "Julian, the accountant called twice on the way over. We need to move fast on this." The trio entered the dining room, a space usually filled with the scent of Martha's pot roast and the sound of laughter. Now it felt like a cold boardroom. Julian didn't even take off his coat before clearing the mahogany table of its lace runner to make room for a mountain of manila folders and spreadsheets. "Sit down, Emily," Julian commanded, his voice echoing the technique of causing strong emotions through shock. He wasn't wasting time on pleasantries. Also present was Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime estate lawyer, a man who looked like he was carved out of old parchment. He was thin, wore thick spectacles, and seemed deeply uncomfortable with the predatory energy radiating from the two brothers. He sat at the head of the table, his gnarled hands hovering over a stack of legal documents. Mark opened his briefcase and pulled out a series of P&L statements for his restaurant. "Look, I'm going to be blunt," Mark said, his voice rising with a desperate edge. "The bistro is hemorrhaging cash. I've got creditors breathing down my neck, and the lease is up for renewal. I can't wait 6 months for probate. I need my share of the liquid assets and the commercial property sale proceeds now." Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. Mark is right, and the IRS isn't known for its patience regarding estate taxes. If we don't settle the distribution and file the preliminary paperwork by Monday, the penalties will start eating into the principal. It's a miracle-wash, faith-based hook to suggest we can just let this sit, he added with a cynical twist on the idea of faith. Emily looked at the documents being shoved toward her. They were filled with jargon, capital gains, stepped-up basis, liquidity discounts. It was a labyrinth designed to confuse her. She looked away, her gaze landing on the small wooden step stool in the corner of the kitchen, the one she had bought so her mother could still reach the spice cabinet even when her knees began to fail. "I haven't even had a chance to wash the funeral clothes," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom was buried 4 hours ago. Can't we just sit for a moment? Talk about her?" "We are talking about her," Julian snapped. "We are talking about the legacy she spent 40 years building. Do you want to see it dissolved by the state because you're being sentimental?" Julian pulled a specific document from the pile, a map of their mother's holdings. He tapped a red circle around a large 5-story commercial building in the heart of the Providence Financial District. "This is the crown jewel," he said. "Current market valuation is approximately $5 million. It's a prime transformation hook for anyone looking to redevelop the area." Mark leaned in, his eyes darting between the map and Julian. And the house? Julian turned his gaze toward Emily. This was the moment he had been preparing for since he made that phone call in the church hallway. Emily, we've given this a lot of thought. You've lived here for 8 years. You know every creak in these floorboards. It wouldn't be right to uproot you. For a split second, Emily felt a flicker of hope, an unlikely hero hook in the form of a brotherly gesture. Perhaps they did care. So, Julian continued, his voice dropping into a tone of fake magnanimity, here is the proposal. You keep this house. It's a beautiful colonial, worth about $200,000 in its current condition. It's your sanctuary, your silent voice hook. Emily frowned. And the rest? The commercial building? The investment accounts? Julian's face hardened. Mark and I will take the commercial building. We'll split the equity and use the investment accounts to cover the immediate tax burdens and Mark's business debts. It's a matter of justice and redemption. Wait, Emily said, her heart starting to race. That's not an even split. That's $5 million for the two of you and a $200,000 house for me? How is that fair? Mark scoffed, wiping sweat from his forehead. Fair? Emily, you've lived here rent-free for nearly a decade. You haven't had a mortgage. You haven't had to pay for groceries or utilities. Mom covered all of that. If you believe God still performs miracles, you'll realize how much you've already benefited. I was her caregiver, Emily cried, her voice cracking. I gave up my career. I haven't had a vacation in years. I did the work of 3 nurses, 24 hours a day. Julian leaned forward, his eyes like flint. And we appreciate that, Emily. We really do. But let's look at the numbers. If we had put Mom in a high-end assisted living facility, it would have cost $15,000 a month. Over 8 years, that's over $1 million. Think of the house as your payment. You've been compensated in room and board. Now sign the preliminary distribution agreement so we can move forward. He slid a fountain pen across the table. The gold nib caught the light, looking like a dagger. Emily looked at the pen, then at her brothers. She realized then that they weren't her saviors. They were vultures who had been waiting for the heart to stop beating so they could pick the bones clean. The silence in the dining room was thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. Emily looked at the golden nib of Julian's pen, then back at her brothers. The manila folders spread across the mahogany table felt like a fortress they had built to keep her out of her own family's legacy. Julian stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading Providence light, while Mark nervously tapped his fingers on his leather briefcase, his eyes darting to the kitchen door as if expecting their mother to walk through it and end this nightmare. Pay rent? Emily's voice was a ghost of a sound, a thin thread of disbelief. Julian, I didn't live here. I served here. I didn't stay in this house because I couldn't afford an apartment. I stayed because you told me you were too busy with the merger in London, and Mark said the restaurant would fail if he spent even one night away from the kitchen. Julian didn't turn around. The why is emotional, Emily. The what is financial. You occupied the master suite adjacent guest room. You consumed utilities, groceries, and property taxes that were paid for by Mother's estate, an estate Mark and I have been funding through our lack of early inheritance. If you believe God led Bear to save her, comment Amen. But God didn't pay the heating bill for the last 8 winters. Mother did. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted the tension. Emily rose, grateful for the escape, but Julian was faster. He intercepted her in the hallway. Through the frosted glass of the door, Emily saw the blurred shape of Mrs. Gable, their neighbor from 2 doors down. She was a stout, kind-hearted woman who had lived on this street for 40 years and had often brought Emily jars of homemade jam during the hardest months of Martha's illness. Julian opened the door just a crack. Mrs. Gable, he said, his voice a perfect imitation of a grieving son. Oh, Julian, I saw the cars. I brought over a warm apple pie and some pot roast for the family, Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling with genuine sympathy. I wanted to see Emily. That poor girl must be exhausted. That is so kind of you, Julian replied, blocking the doorway with his broad frame. But Emily is actually resting under a doctor's supervision right now. The funeral took a tremendous toll. We are currently in the middle of some very sensitive, private family matters regarding the estate. I'm sure you understand. It's a justice and redemption hook. Oh, of course, I didn't mean to intrude, Mrs. Gable stammered, looking disappointed. We appreciate your prayers, Julian said smoothly, taking the pie and closing the door before Emily could even say hello. Julian walked back into the dining room and set the pie on the sideboard as if it were a common nuisance. Emily felt a stinging behind her eyes. That pie represented the only warmth left in this house, and Julian had treated it like a distraction from his spreadsheets. She sat back down, her mind spinning back to 2018. She remembered the day she had to call her creative director at the design firm in Boston. She had been a rising star in graphic design, her portfolio filled with vibrant modern branding concepts. But the calls from the pharmacy, the hospital, and the home care nurses became a cacophony she couldn't ignore. I can't keep the 60-hour weeks, she had told her boss, her voice breaking. My mother needs me. She had transitioned to freelance work, taking on small, low-paying logo gigs just so she could be home to administer the noontime insulin and the 3:00 p.m. physical therapy sessions. She watched her career, her silent voice, fade into the background of bedpans and medication logs. Her unlikely hero hook was the dog or ordinary person becoming a savior. She had become a savior to her mother at the cost of her own future. Emily, you're drifting, Julian said, snapping his fingers. He pulled a fresh, crisp sheet of paper from his folder, a spreadsheet titled Comparative Care Cost Analysis. Mark leaned forward, his face flushed. Look, Emily, we're just being realistic. I've had to take out high-interest loans to keep the bistro afloat. I don't have the luxury of sentimentality right now. This story will restore your faith. But faith doesn't pay my suppliers. Julian took a highlighter and ran it across a row of figures. I've done the research. Professional, 24/7 in-home nursing care in Rhode Island averages roughly $4,000 a month for the level of care mother required. Over 96 months, that is $384,000. He tossed the paper onto the center of the table. When you factor in the fair market rent for your living quarters, the food, the use of the vehicle, and the health insurance mother paid for you, the total benefit you received exceeds $500,000. The house is worth $200,000. Mathematically, Emily, you are already ahead of the curve. If you want to see the wicked punished and the good rewarded, you should realize you've already been rewarded. Emily stared at the numbers. They were black ink on white paper, cold and devoid of the sweat, the tears, and the blood she had spilled in this house. She thought of the nights she had slept on the floor next to her mother's bed because Martha was afraid of the dark. She thought of the time she had to physically lift her mother into the bathtub, feeling the sharp, white-hot pop in her lower back that had never quite healed. You're charging me? Emily whispered. You're charging me for the privilege of watching our mother die while you were in first class to London? Julian's face didn't move. He looked at her as if she were a difficult client refusing to accept a fair contract. I am quantifying the exchange, Emily. We all made sacrifices. Mark and I sacrificed our time with Mother. You sacrificed your career, but you were compensated with a roof over your head. It's a transformation hook. From pain to happiness, we all want to move on. He leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto hers. By my calculations, you've actually spent your entire inheritance, and then some. We're being generous by letting you keep the house at all. Sign the document, Emily. Don't make this a miracle and faith-based hook where we have to involve the courts. It'll be cleaner for everyone. Emily looked at the paper. It was a calculus of cold blood. It was the moment she realized that in her brother's eyes she wasn't a sister. She was a debt that had finally come due. The air in the dining room had turned stagnant, thick with the scent of the apple pie Julian had dismissed and the sterile, metallic tang of his spreadsheet logic. Emily stared at the paper on the table, the black-inked calculus of cold blood. For a moment, her vision blurred. The numbers began to swim, transforming into the countless hours she had spent in the dim light of the hallway, the silent tick of the oxygen concentrator, and the rhythmic, labored breathing of a woman who had once been the sun around which their family orbited. You've been compensated, Emily whispered, the words tasting like ash. She looked at Julian, who stood by the window with his arms crossed, his bespoke suit a barrier against any trace of humanity. She looked at Mark, whose face was a mask of desperate greed, his eyes darting to the mahogany table as if the wood itself could provide the cash to save his failing bistro. The transformation hook, the journey from pain to happiness, felt like a cruel joke. There was no happiness here, only a miraculous change from a family into a group of strangers fighting over the spoils of a life. Suddenly, Emily stood up. The movement was sharp, sudden, and it sent a jolt of white-hot lightning through her lower back. She didn't wince. Instead, she unbuttoned her black wool coat with trembling fingers and let it slide off her shoulders, pooling on the floor like a discarded shadow. "Emily, what are you doing?" Mark stammered, his face flushing even deeper. She ignored him. She was wearing a thin, charcoal gray sweater. She turned her back to them and pulled the collar down, exposing the nape of her neck and the uneven line of her shoulders. Her right shoulder was visibly lower than her left, a permanent tilt to her frame. "Do you see this?" she asked, her voice low and vibrating, with a suppressed roar. "This isn't a genetic quirk. It's a herniated disc from 3 years ago. The night Mom fell in the bathroom, and I had to lift her dead weight off the tile while the two of you were too busy to answer your phones." She turned back around, her eyes blazing with the light of a silent voice hook, a soul connection that transcended their corporate language. "I spent 8 years becoming invisible. I didn't just give up my graphic design career. I gave up my body. I gave up my sleep. And more than anything, I gave up being a mother to my own daughter." At the doorway, a shadow moved. Sarah, Emily's 18-year-old daughter, stood there. She was a quiet, observant girl with her mother's wide eyes and a shock of dark hair. She wore a faded college hoodie and jeans, her face pale, her eyes brimming with tears as she watched the uncles she had once respected strip her mother of her dignity. Sarah had grown up in the shadow of her grandmother's illness, learning to cook her own meals and do her own laundry at 12 because her mother was busy changing IV bags and crush medication. Emily saw her daughter, and her heart broke all over again. "Sarah had to raise herself," Emily said, gesturing toward the girl. "When she made the dean's list, I was in the ER with Mom. When she had her first heartbreak, I was in the pharmacy line at midnight. I wasn't just living rent-free. I was drowning, and the only person who tried to pull me up was a child who shouldn't have had to." Julian didn't move. He looked at Sarah with a brief flicker of annoyance before returning his gaze to the spreadsheet. "Sentimentality doesn't change the bottom line, Emily. We all have family pressures." "Justice and redemption!" Emily cried, her voice finally breaking into a scream that echoed through the quiet house. "You want to satisfy your desire for a payout? Fine. But don't you dare call this fair. Don't you dare tell me I was paid in room and board." Emily leaned over the table, her hands flat on the polished wood, her face inches from Julian's. "Have you ever smelled the rot of a soiled diaper at 4 a.m.? Her voice was a jagged blade. "Have you ever felt the cold sweat on a woman's forehead as she whimpers in pain at 3 a.m., begging for a god she thinks has forgotten her?" Mark flinched, pulling back his chair. Julian remained stoic, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. "I sat by that bed for 3,000 nights, Emily continued, her tears finally falling, hot and fast. "I watched her hands, those beautiful hands that used to bake bread, turn into claws of bone and skin. And in her final hour, when the world was slipping away, she reached out. She squeezed my hand so hard I thought she'd break my fingers. Her mouth moved. She was trying to tell me something." Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. She didn't mumble about the commercial building. She didn't whisper about the tax basis. She was trying to say thank you. She was trying to say she loved me. She straightened up, her tilted shoulders a testament to her unlikely heroism. "You are trying to put a price tag on that love. You are trying to turn 8 years of my life into a bill for groceries and heat. You think you can silence the truth with your folders and your high-interest loans. But Sarah is standing right there. She saw it all. She knows what a savior looks like, and it isn't a man in a bespoke suit." Sarah walked into the room then, her hand trembling as she reached for her mother's. She didn't say a word to her uncles. She just looked at them with a cold, piercing clarity that made Mark look away in shame. "If you believe God led us through this," Emily said, her voice regaining its strength, "then you know that he still performs miracles. And the biggest miracle is that I haven't walked out of this house and left you to your greed." She grabbed the spreadsheet Julian had so carefully prepared and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it onto the pie Mrs. Gable had brought. "Get out," Emily said, her voice flat and final. "We are done for tonight. I won't sign a single thing until I can breathe again, without smelling your betrayal." Julian picked up his briefcase, his face a mask of iron once more. "We'll be back on Monday, Emily. The tax office won't wait for your emotions to settle. This is a transformation journey we all have to finish." As the front door clicked shut behind them, the house fell into a silence deeper than any Emily had ever known. She collapsed into a chair, her hands still gripped by Sarah's. The invisible daughter was no longer invisible, but the cost of being seen had left her more broken than ever. The heavy silence that followed Julian and Mark's departure was not a peaceful one. It was a silence charged with the electricity of a storm that had only just begun. Emily sat at the dining table, her hands still trembling as she stared at the crumpled spreadsheet resting atop the cold apple pie. Beside her, Sarah remained a silent anchor, her youthful face etched with a maturity forced upon her by the evening's cruelty. The colonial house in Providence, usually a place of soft memories and the ticking of the grandfather clock, felt like a theater of war where the lines of battle were drawn in ink and blood. An hour had passed when a soft, hesitant tapping came at the back kitchen door. Emily stiffened, her first instinct being that Julian had returned to press his advantage. But the rhythm was different, tentative and apologetic. Emily rose, her back protesting with a sharp twinge, and walked toward the kitchen. Standing on the porch, partially obscured by the shadows of the overgrown honeysuckle, was Clara Sterling. Clara was Mark's wife, a woman who had always seemed like a quiet ghost at family gatherings. She was soft-spoken, with kind eyes that often looked tired, and she possessed a gentle grace that felt increasingly out of place in the Sterling family tree. Tonight she wore a simple beige trench coat, her hair slightly damp from the lingering mist. "Emily," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crickets. "May I come in? Please. I waited until I saw their cars leave the neighborhood." Emily stepped aside, surprised. "Clara, what are you doing here? I thought you were heading back to the bistro with Mark." Clara entered the kitchen, looking around the room as if she were seeing it for the first time. She sat down at the small breakfast nook where Emily and Martha used to share tea. "Mark thinks I went home to rest, but I couldn't. Not after what I saw tonight. My husband, he's desperate, Emily. The bistro is his dream, but it's turned him into someone I barely recognize. The way they treated you, it was shameful." Emily leaned against the counter, her exhaustion beginning to weigh her down. "He's my brother, Clara. Julian, too. I knew they were ambitious, but I didn't think they were capable of calculating the price of a diaper change." Clara reached out and took Emily's hand. Her touch was warm and steady. "I have to tell you something. Something about your mother. In those last few months, when you were at the pharmacy or the hospital, Martha and I would talk. Sometimes she just wanted someone to listen to the things she couldn't say to you because she didn't want to break your heart even more." Emily's breath caught. "What did she say?" "She was a transformation hook for me," Clara said, her eyes glistening. "She showed me that healing comes from truth. She used to sit by that large bay window in the parlor for hours. She'd look out toward the northeast, toward Boston, and she would just sigh. It was a sound that broke my heart every time. Every time Julian or Mark called to say they were too busy for a visit, she'd stare at that horizon. She told me once, 'Clara, my sons are building empires of glass, but they've forgotten the ground they stand on. They think I'm too old to see the vultures circling, but I know my boys.'" This was the silent voice hook, a soul connection that transcended language. Emily could see the scene perfectly. Her mother, frail but sharp, watching the world through the glass, realizing that the love she had poured into her sons was being returned in excuses. "She knew this day would come," Clara continued, her voice growing firm. "She knew Julian's greed and Mark's desperation would collide. She told me that she had spent her life trying to satisfy the desire to see the wicked punished and the good rewarded. She didn't want you to be the victim of their ambition." Clara reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with wax, a relic of a more formal time. "A few weeks before she became bedridden for the last time, she called me over. She made me promise, swear on my faith in God, that I wouldn't say a word until the moment was right. She said, Clara, wait until they show their true faces. Wait until they try to strip Emily of her worth. Only then, give her this. Emily stared at the envelope. It felt heavy, as if it contained the weight of all the secrets Martha had kept to protect her youngest daughter. With shaking fingers, Emily broke the seal. Inside was a single silver key, old, ornate, and etched with a series of numbers, along with a short, handwritten note on Martha's personal stationery. To my Emily, the note read in Martha's elegant, albeit shaky script. I know you are tired. I know you think I didn't see the sacrifices you made, but I saw every tear. I felt every touch. I knew Julian and Mark would try to turn my departure into a business transaction. They see buildings. I see my daughter. This key belongs to a private safe at the bank on Westminster Street. It is the justice and redemption you deserve. Use it when you are ready to stop being invisible. Clara watched Emily, her expression one of immense relief. She said this was her call to faith hook. She wanted you to know that she was still performing miracles from beyond. She knew that only when their greed was at its peak would you have the strength to fight back. A safe? Emily whispered, clutching the silver key to her chest. She never mentioned a safe. Not once. She couldn't, Clara said, standing up. She knew Julian would find a way to take it if he knew. He was always her unlikely hero, but she realized he had become the villain of this story. I have to go now, Emily. If Mark finds out I was here, it will only make things worse. But please, go to that bank. Don't let them take what she intended for you. As Clara walked toward the back door, she paused and looked back. She loved you more than her own life, Emily. She knew you were the only one who truly understood her silent voice. That key isn't just about money. It's about the truth. The door clicked shut, leaving Emily alone in the kitchen with the silver key. The transformation hook was beginning to take hold, a miraculous change from pain to a spark of happiness and hope. For the first time in 8 years, Emily didn't feel like the victim of her brother's calculations. She felt like a daughter who had been given a sword. The morning sun over Providence was sharp and unforgiving, casting long, geometric shadows across the marble facade of the bank on Westminster Street. Emily stood before the towering bronze doors, her fingers tracing the jagged ridges of the silver key Clara had given her. Beside her stood Clara, looking nervous but resolute, her eyes scanning the street as if Julian's black SUV might appear at any moment to thwart their mission. "Are you ready?" Clara whispered, her breath hitching in the cold morning air. Emily nodded, though her heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I've spent 8 years waiting for Mom to wake up, to speak, to tell me what to do. I never realized she had already spoken. I just didn't have the key." They entered the bank, a cathedral of commerce with high vaulted ceilings and the muffled clatter of keyboards. They were greeted by Mr. Sterling Vane, no relation, a senior vault manager who looked as though he had been curated from a museum of New England aristocracy. He was a man of silver hair and pinstriped elegance, possessing a quiet dignity that commanded immediate respect. "Miss Sterling," he said, bowing his head slightly as he inspected the silver key and Emily's identification. "Your mother was a very far-sighted woman. She established this private box nearly 3 years ago, shortly after her first stroke. She was quite insistent that only you, or Clara, under specific circumstances, ever gain access." He led them down a spiraling staircase into the bowels of the building, where the air grew cool and silent. The vault door was a masterpiece of stainless steel and clockwork precision. Mr. Sterling Vane turned his key, Emily turned hers, and the heavy door swung open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside the small private viewing room, Emily was handed a long metal box. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Clara stood back, giving Emily the space she needed to breathe. At the very top of the box sat a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by the touch of her mother's hands. Emily opened it, and the scent of Martha, dried lavender and old paper, surged forth. It wasn't just a diary. It was a meticulous ledger of a mother's secret observations. Emily's eyes blurred as she read the entries. Martha had recorded everything. October 2022, Julian called today. He asked for $150,000 for a bridge loan for his new venture in London. I gave it to him, knowing I will never see it again. He didn't ask how my breathing was. He didn't even speak to Emily, who was in the kitchen boiling my syringes. Further down, January 2024. Mark came by. He was sweating and shaking. He owes $80,000 to people who don't take excuses. I paid his gambling debts from my private savings. He kissed my cheek and left within 10 minutes. He didn't notice Emily sleeping on the floor beside my bed because I was afraid of the tremors. Emily turned the pages, her heart breaking with every line. Her mother hadn't been a passive victim of her brother's neglect. She had been a witness. She had seen the vultures circling, just as Clara had said. Then Emily found the entry that shattered her. June 15th. I heard Emily crying in the laundry room tonight. She thinks I'm asleep, but the walls are thin and my heart is sharp. She is crying from sheer exhaustion, her back bent from lifting me, her youth slipping away in this quiet house. I owe this child my entire life. My sons have taken my money. My daughter has given me her soul. I must make this right. Emily collapsed into the velvet-lined chair, a sob tearing from her throat. She wept with a violence that shook her entire frame, not just for her mother's death, but for the overwhelming realization that she had been seen. For 8 years, she had felt like a ghost, a silent voice haunting her own home. But Martha had been listening to every tear. Clara moved forward, placing a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. She knew Emily. She knew every bit of it. Beneath the journal lay a thick, blue-backed document, sealed with the official gold leaf of a notary public. It was the last will and testament of Martha Sterling, dated 2 years prior. Emily wiped her eyes and began to read the legal prose. It was a justice and redemption hook, in its purest form. The language was clear, devoid of the confusing jargon Julian had used to bully her. Because my sons, Julian and Mark, have already received substantial portions of their inheritance through various private gifts and debt settlements totaling over $3 million, the document read, I hereby distribute the remainder of my estate as follows. To my daughter Emily, who has provided for my care with a devotion beyond measure, I bequeath 70% of all assets, including the Sterling Commercial Building and the family home in Providence. The text continued. To Julian and Mark, I bequeath 15% each. It is my hope that this distribution provides the miracle and faith-based hook required for them to understand that a mother's love is not a business transaction and that a daughter's sacrifice is not a debt to be charged back to her. Emily looked up at Clara, her face pale. 70%. She gave me the building. She gave me everything. She didn't give it to you, Emily, Clara said softly, her eyes reflecting the transformation hook of their shared journey. You earned it with every medication you measured and every night you stayed awake. This is the unlikely hero hook she planned. She knew the only way to stop Julian was to hit him where it hurt most, his wallet. The transformation hook was now complete. Emily felt a surge of strength she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just a caregiver anymore. She was the majority owner of the Sterling legacy. The silent voice now had the power of a gavel. We have to get to the lawyer, Emily said, her voice now firm and clear. The real lawyer, not Julian's puppet. As they left the vault, Emily clutched the journal and the blue-back document to her chest like a shield. She felt her mother's spirit beside her, no longer a sighing ghost by the window, but a silent commander guiding her toward the final confrontation. The miracle had been performed. Now it was time for the redemption. A biting wind swept through the canyons of downtown Providence, whistling between the glass towers and the historic stone facades. The morning was crisp and dangerously clear, the kind of New England day where the light is so sharp it feels like it could cut. Inside the executive suite of Pendergast and Associates, the atmosphere was even colder. The office was a temple of old money aesthetics, dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound books that smelled of centuries of litigation, and a view of the icy river that seemed to mock the warmth of the sun. Julian sat at the head of a long conference table, his charcoal suit immaculate, his expression one of bored superiority. Beside him sat Mark, who was nervously twisting his wedding ring, his face pale and slick with sweat. Across from them was Arthur Pendergast, a man who looked like he had been born in a tuxedo. He was in his late 70s, with eyebrows like snowdrifts and a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed by silk. He was the quintessential fixer for the Sterling brothers, a man whose specialty was making inconvenient family members disappear into the fine print. "We have the buyers for the commercial building on the line, Julian," Pendergast said, tapping a gold-plated fountain pen. "They've agreed to the $5 million valuation. We just need the final signatures on the sales agreement and the preliminary probate waiver from Emily. Once that's done, the liquidation can proceed." Julian checked his watch. "She's late, but then Emily was never one for punctuality when reality was on the line. She's probably still weeping over a wilted rose bush." The heavy oak doors opened, and the silent voice that had been suppressed for 8 years finally entered the room. Emily walked in, but she was not the gaunt, broken figure they had seen at the dinner table. She wore a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun. Her posture was straight, defying the pain in her back. Behind her followed Sarah, her eyes bright with a new kind of pride, and Clara, who walked with a quiet defiance that made Mark gasp. But it was the fourth person who made Pendergast stop tapping his pen. Eleanor Vance stepped into the room with the grace of sculpted ice. She was a woman in her 60s, known as one of the most formidable probate attorneys in the Northeast. She carried a slim leather briefcase and an aura of absolute authority. "Julian, Mark," Emily said, her voice steady and resonant. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She took the chair opposite Julian, Sarah, and Clara, flanking her like guards. Eleanor Vance sat at her side, unfolding a single sheet of paper. "What is this, Emily?" Julian asked, his lip curling. "You brought a lawyer to a family meeting? I thought we discussed the calculus of the situation. Don't tell me you're trying to invoke a miracle and faith-based hook now." "We're not here for a discussion, Julian," Eleanor Vance said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We're here to present the truth. My client has no intention of signing your waivers. In fact, we are here to challenge every action you've taken since Martha Sterling's passing." Julian laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "On what grounds? Emily was a caregiver. She's been compensated. Pendergast has the records." Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal they had found in the vault. She placed it on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. Beside it, she laid the blue-backed, notarized will. "This is the record, Julian," Emily said. "In Mom's own hand. She saw every cent you took, every loan you never repaid, every time you left her alone while I was in the trenches. If you believe God still performs miracles, this story will restore your faith in justice." Julian's face went white as he saw the blue backing of the notarized document. Pendergast reached for it, his snowdrift eyebrows knitting together as he scanned the 70-15-15 distribution. This can't be valid," Mark stammered, his voice cracking. "Mom wasn't in her right mind. She was sick. Emily must have coerced her. Transformation comes through truth," Eleanor Vance said calmly. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small tablet. "Martha Sterling was a far-sighted woman. She knew you would claim incapacity. That's why, exactly 1 year ago, she asked me to visit her. She wanted to record a statement of intent, witnessed by 2 independent doctors who verified her mental clarity." Eleanor pressed play. The screen came to life, showing Martha Sterling sitting in her favorite armchair by the window in Providence. She looked frail, but her eyes were like steel. "My name is Martha Sterling," the voice crackled through the tablet speakers, filled with a poetic, mythological quality. "I am making this recording to ensure my daughter Emily is never silenced again. For 8 years, she has been my hands, my feet, and my heart. My sons, Julian and Mark, have already taken their share of this family's lifeblood. They see my estate as a carcass to be picked clean, but I am the one who built this, and I am the one who decides who deserves the keys to the kingdom." Martha leaned forward in the video, her gaze seemingly boring through the screen at Julian. "Emily is my savior. She is the unlikely hero of this story. Julian, Mark, you have been paid in full. To my Emily, I give the rest. This is my justice." The video ended, leaving a deafening silence in the room. Mark buried his face in his hands. Julian, however, lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "This is a setup. I'll tie this up in court for a decade. You think you can take my share? I'm the eldest. I am the one who kept this family's name in the papers. Eleanor Vance leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Julian, I would be very careful about your next words. This journal isn't just a record of your greed, it's a record of your liabilities. Specifically, the $1 million investment you took from your mother's private account 4 years ago to cover the shortfall in your London merger. Julian froze. We have the bank transfers, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. It was never a loan, Julian. It was a transfer of funds based on a forged power of attorney. Martha didn't realize the extent of the forgery until she found the documents months later. She chose not to report it then because she was a mother. But she recorded the evidence here. She tapped the journal. If you contest this will, we will not only win the probate battle, but we will hand this ledger and the forensic evidence of that forgery to the district attorney. We will move to recover that $1 million plus interest. It's not just civil, Julian. It's criminal. It is the ultimate justice and redemption hook. Julian looked at Pendergast. The old lawyer looked away, slowly closing his gold fountain pen. The calculus had changed. The corporate giant was suddenly a small man standing in the ruins of his own making. Mark, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. Do something. But Mark was looking at Clara. She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a sad kind of pity. It's over, Mark. Mom knew. She knew all along. Emily stood up, looking at her brothers not with hatred, but with a profound, weary clarity. If you believe God led me to save her, Julian, then you know he also led me to this room. You can sign the acknowledgement of the 70-15-15 split now, and we can go our separate NHA. Or you can fight, and I will ensure that the wicked are punished. Sarah stepped forward and placed a hand on the table. Comment amen if you think she's right, she whispered, a small, defiant smile on her lips. Julian sank into his chair, the weight of the $1 million ghost finally crushing him. For the first time in his life, the man who spoke in empires had nothing left to say. The transformation was complete. The invisible daughter was now the master of the sterling name. The winter chill that had gripped Providence for weeks finally began to soften, giving way to the hesitant, golden warmth of an early New England spring. The air, once sharp enough to cut, now carried the faint, earthy scent of thawing soil and the distant salt of the Narragansett Bay. In the backyard of the Sterling family home, the skeletal remains of the garden were beginning to stir with the miracle and faith-based hook of new life. Emily stood on the back porch, watching the morning light spill across the fields. For the first time in 8 years, her breathing was deep and rhythmic, no longer hitched with the chronic anxiety of a caregiver awaiting the next crisis. The transformation hook was visible in her very stance. Though her shoulders still bore the slight tilt of her injuries, the tension that had once corded her neck had vanished. A car pulled into the gravel driveway, not the aggressive black SUV of her eldest brother, but a modest, slightly battered sedan. Mark stepped out. He looked different than he had at the law office. The frantic, sweaty desperation had been replaced by a quiet, somber humility. He walked toward the porch slowly, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Emily, he said, stopping at the base of the stairs. He didn't look up immediately. I brought some things, some files from the bistro. I'm closing it down, Emily, selling the equipment to pay off the remaining creditors. Emily walked down the steps to meet him. You're giving up the restaurant, Mark? It wasn't a dream anymore, Mark whispered, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was raw with a justice and redemption hook of his own. It was a cage. I was so afraid of failing that I became a monster to the only person who was actually holding this family together. I sat in the dark last night, thinking about that spreadsheet Julian made. I realized I was nodding along to a lie because it was easier than facing my own debts. I'm so sorry, Emily. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I accept Mom's will. Every bit of it. I'm going to start over. Maybe just as a line cook somewhere quiet, somewhere I can just cook again. Emily felt a tear prick her eye, an emotion-based hook caused by the unexpected sincerity in his voice. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. It takes a lot of strength to admit you lost your way, Mark. Mom always said you were the one with the biggest heart, even if you let the world bruise it too easily. They stood in silence for a moment, a silent voice hook of reconciliation passing between them. The unlikely hero in this moment was the man who had the courage to lose everything to find his soul. Julian, however, was a different story. He had signed the papers at Pendergast's office without uttering a single word. He had left Rhode Island that same evening, retreating to the glass and steel of his life in Boston. He hadn't called. He hadn't apologized. He had simply vanished into the shame of his forged empires. Emily knew that for Julian, the wicked being punished was simply the reality of being ignored by the history he had tried so hard to control. A few weeks later, Emily sat in the sun-drenched waiting room of the Neuroscience Institute of New England. She was there to see Dr. Eris Thorne, a world-renowned spinal surgeon who specialized in complex disc herniations. Dr. Thorne was a man of immense calm, with silver-rimmed glasses and a way of speaking that made the most terrifying procedures sound like a transformation journey toward healing. "The surgery was a success, Emily," Dr. Thorne said during her follow-up. "The pressure on the nerve is gone. You'll need physical therapy, and you'll never be a weightlifter, but you will walk without pain. You've carried a heavy load for a long time. It's time to let the medicine carry you for a while." With the pain receding, Emily finally fulfilled a promise that had been deferred for nearly a decade. She and Sarah boarded a plane to the Amalfi Coast in Italy. It was the healing journey she had whispered about to Sarah when her daughter was just a child. They spent 14 days lost in the blue of the Mediterranean and the scent of lemon groves. They laughed until they cried, and they talked about things other than illness and lawyers. Sarah, no longer the invisible granddaughter, bloomed in the Italian sun, her laughter a silent voice hook that finally found its strength. When they returned to Providence, Emily turned her attention to the house. She hired a team to restore the wood, but she did the garden herself. She planted hundreds of transformation roses, hybrids that changed color as they bloomed. She turned the overgrown yard into a vibrant sanctuary of color and scent. It was a call to faith hook for the neighborhood. People would stop their cars just to look at the garden that had risen from the ashes of neglect. On a warm Sunday evening, the house was quiet. The sterling commercial building was being managed by a reputable firm, providing a steady income that ensured Sarah's college tuition was never a worry again. Clara had visited earlier, bringing a basket of muffins and news that Mark was actually finding peace in his new, simpler life. Emily sat in her mother's old velvet armchair by the bay window, the silent voice hook location where Martha had once watched the Boston horizon. The chair was soft, smelling faintly of the lavender Emily still used. Sarah came into the room carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to her mother and then sat on the floor, leaning her head against Emily's knee, just as she used to do when she was small. "Mom?" Sarah asked softly. "Yes, honey. Do you think she's happy? Grandma, I mean." Emily looked out at the garden, where the roses were glowing in the twilight. She felt the miracle and faith-based hook of her mother's presence in the very air of the room. "I think she's more than happy, Sarah. I think she's at rest. She knew that justice might come late, but she also knew that love and sincere sacrifice always leave behind seeds of happiness. We just had to wait for the winter to end so they could grow." Emily ran her hand through Sarah's hair. The pain in her back was a dull memory. The betrayal of her brothers was a closed chapter. As the sun dipped below the Rhode Island hills, Emily realized that her mother hadn't just left her a building or a house. She had left her the unlikely hero strength to reclaim her own life. The light faded, but the warmth remained. In the quiet of the Providence evening, the Sterling family had finally found its redemption. This story reminds us that the true measure of a person's life is not found in the cold numbers of a bank account or the square footage of a building, but in the quiet, consistent acts of love and sacrifice we offer to one another. In our daily lives, it is easy to become blinded by ambition or the pressure of material success, much like Julian and Mark. However, as Emily discovered, sincere devotion and integrity create a legacy that no amount of money can buy. Justice may not always arrive when we want it to, but truth has a way of blooming even in the coldest winters. Choose to be the unlikely hero in your own family, the one who listens to the silent voices and values the soul over the transaction. If Emily's journey of resilience and redemption touched your heart today, please help us share this light with others. Like this video to show your support for those who sacrifice in silence. Share this story with a friend or family member who might need a reminder that their hard work is seen. Comment below with your own thoughts or stories of overcoming family challenges. Subscribe and click the notification bell to join our channel, where we honor the strength and wisdom of every generation. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of family and the strength you provide us during our most difficult seasons. We ask for your special blessing upon every person watching today. For the caregivers who are tired, please grant them renewed energy and peace. For those facing injustice, please open doors of redemption and provide them with the courage to stand tall. May your love be the foundation of our homes, and may your grace guide us toward reconciliation and healing. If you believe that God still performs miracles and provides for those who are faithful, please write Amen in the comments below.